Hi. So, in our last discussion we started looking at how evolution and evolutionary principles are important in our contemporary lives, and we discussed how antibiotic resistance and the evolution of that is a huge thing in the context of public health currently and in the very near future. Today we are going to discuss another aspect of how evolution ends up affecting our health, and this is in the context of this fascinating subdiscipline known as evolutionary medicine. Now, what is it? So, evolutionary medicine or Darwinian medicine as it is also called is trying to apply the concepts of evolutionary biology to understand diseases, particularly human diseases. And it asks, why is it and how is it that our evolutionary history makes us vulnerable to various illnesses? Now, why is this important? Remember, when we were talking about various aspects of evolution in the first week, we distinguished between proximate causes and ultimate causes. So, typically medicine, particularly Western medicine, is about proximate causes of diseases. Okay. What causes it? Which deficiency, which germ, which physiological issue and so on. On the other hand, evolutionary medicine says that look, diseases can also have some ultimate causes, evolutionary reasons, and that is what they are trying to figure out. Now, although there have been some writings prior to it, in general it is thought that the field begins with a 1996 book by this famous physician called Randolph Nesse and G.C. Williams. If you remember G.C. Williams, we met his work when we were talking about evolution of aging, right. So, the book was called Why We Get Sick, the New Science of Darwinian Medicine, very nicely written book. Now, if you look at evolutionary medicine, there are a few core concepts. So, there was a 2008 study which mentioned about 14 core concepts. Now, turns out that most of these core concepts we have already discussed in this course. So, I am going to talk about only two which we have not really covered over our last 11 weeks of discussion. So, these two, the first one is related to the concept of defense mechanisms. So, what it suggests is that many symptoms which we consider to be bad, they are not really bad things, they are actually defenses which have been evolved over millennium, and they actually have very nice positive fitness effects. Okay, they help us fight illnesses, they help us fight certain kinds of injuries. The other major concept is that of evolutionary mismatch, which says that we human beings, we have actually evolved for most of our evolutionary history as hunter gatherers, and therefore all our genes, our proteins, our various biochemical pathways, they are optimized for that kind of a lifestyle. However, today when we are in a world which has a very different lifestyle, then that ends up placing a very different kind of environmental pressure to which we are evolutionarily not adapted. And it is this mismatch between how we have evolved and which environment we are finding ourselves now, that is what is leading to a number of major health problems. So, we are going to look at a bunch of examples to see what is meant by these two concepts in evolutionary medicine. But one thing you have to keep in mind over here is that it is a relatively recent discipline, okay, only 30-40 years old, and therefore many of the examples that I am going to show you, these are all work in progress. So, there are good reasons in many cases for us to believe that those things are working the way I am telling you about, but in some of the cases the jury is still out, and that is why I am going to specifically tell you, where we know that this works and what are the cases where there are still experiments to be done and more concepts to be cleared. So, the first example is in the context of morning sickness. So, all of you know that morning sickness is something which affects about 70 to 80% of all pregnant women to some extent or the other. What happens during morning sickness? Essentially, you have a lot of nausea, there is vomiting, and there is a major aversion to certain kinds of food. So, these are the main symptoms of this. Now, obviously, it is a major cause of discomfort, and therefore, the question arises that why is it that this particular condition is there? Is it because something goes wrong in the physiology? And that is what people thought for a very long time, although to be frank, even today we do not know the precise underlying causes for morning sickness, but people have been trying to cure this with different kinds of drugs, sometimes with very bad results. But all this changed when in 2000, no, not in 2000, I think in 1988, this lady called Margie Prophet, she came up with this hypothesis saying that morning sickness is actually an adaptation to protect the growing fetus. It is not at all an illness. Okay. So, it has an evolutionary reason. Now, why exactly did she say that? So, one of the reasons she said that was that symptoms of morning sickness are particularly strong during the first trimester, and this is the period when the fetus is most vulnerable to toxins. Now, where are toxins coming from? Okay. Now, turns out that the plants, they have evolved all kinds of chemicals to fight off herbivores, both insects and other larger animals. Now, most of the time when it comes to the crop plants, we human beings, we do not even notice that there is a toxin, simply because the adult body of a human being typically is capable of neutralizing or taking care of most of those toxins. Okay, we have evolved like that. However, when the baby is evolving or baby is forming, developing, particularly during the first 3 months, the baby is still not expressing all the adult genes, right. As a result of that, the baby is a lot more vulnerable to those plant toxins compared to the adult. And it is not only about plants. Even if you look at other things like fish or meat, sometimes they end up containing other pathogens which may not be good for the baby. Therefore, the whole idea is that nausea and that aversion to food, that is primarily related to those items, food items, which can carry these kinds of pathogens or toxins. Okay. Now, this sounds a slightly far-fetched idea, but it is actually not. So, I strongly recommend that you look at this second paper, Flaxman and Sherman 2000, where they have actually looked at the various aspects of this morning sickness as an evolutionary adaptation hypothesis, and they have talked about among other things what are the various vegetables to and food items towards which aversion happens and what kind of toxins they can contain. Now, this is explaining nausea. What about vomiting? So, the whole idea is that, see, we have to eat, right? The mothers have to eat because the energy expenditure of carrying a baby is pretty high. So, there are some toxins that are nonetheless going in. So, the whole idea is that the vomiting helps to expel any of those harmful substances that are still going in through the food. Now, what reason do we have to believe that this works? There are many lines of evidence, as I told you, look at the Flaxman-Sherman paper, but the main reason for which we believe that this works is because if you look at what happens to women who have morning sickness, turns out that their probability of having miscarriages are much lower compared to those women who did not have morning sickness. So, this is one reason for which right now the view is that don't really fight morning sickness, it is an evolutionary adaptation. So, let it be, it is actually going to be more helpful for the mother. A similar thing can be said about something that we really hate, which is fever. right. Now, whenever we have fever, typically first thing that we do is we take some paracetamol or ibuprofen or any of the many other antipyretics. Now, perhaps you would not be so willing to take an antipyretic if you knew that this particular symptom of increase in body temperature due to a microbial infection, humans are not the only organism to have it. Turns out that several vertebrates and non-vertebrate species, all of them tend to show this thing, which suggests that this is a very old thing, very old physiological response, and it is something that is quite widespread, which essentially means that it is something that can potentially have evolutionary benefits. And in this particular case, people have actually worked out that increase in body temperature actually helps the body to fight various infections. Okay. In what way does it do so? Many ways. I am giving you this paper for people who are interested and want to get into it in some amount of detail. At a very rough level, what happens is that that increased temperature that can end up taking the body temperature outside the optimal temperature range for some microbes. More importantly, that increased temperature, it ends up recruiting the immune cells and makes it easier for the immune cells to fight the infections. Now, in spite of that, very interestingly, doctors many a time prefer to reduce the fever using antipyretics. Now, why exactly is that happening? What are the various changes that happens at the molecular level because of which increase in temperature can help in fighting infections? I am not going to deal with that over here, but I will recommend that you check out this video. It is not a long video, very nicely done, and this information in this video is part of this course, so you definitely need to look at it. So, this is another example where what we think is bad is actually a part of our evolved defense system. Now, we go to the other hypothesis, which is related to evolutionary mismatch. And one of the major examples of a potential evolutionary mismatch is myopia. Okay, it is a very common thing. I mean, you can see when I have it, and this is a situation where the light that is coming from a distance, instead of getting focused on the retina, it actually ends up getting focused in front of the retina, right, because of which the image that we see from a which is coming from a distance, that image is blurred, and this primarily happens because there is an elongation of the eyeball. Now, very interestingly, if you look at hunter gatherers or people who practice subsistence agriculture. What is subsistence agriculture? So, there are lots of people who grow only that amount of food which is sufficient for themselves. They do not sell their agricultural products. So, that is what is known as subsistence agriculture. So, if you look at such people, the rate of myopia amongst them is actually less than 3%. Yet, if you look at the global population, in 2000, 1406 million people, okay, had myopia, which is about 23% of the world population. And if you try to project it forward, by 2050, the estimate is that about 50% of the world population, which is about 4,758 million people, will have myopia. Myopia nowadays has become so common that most of the time we do not even notice somebody wearing glasses. In fact, in many cases it has become a fashion statement, it is that common, right. But the question is, how, why? Amongst hunter gatherers, just a few thousand years back, the rate was so low. If you look at modern humans, the rate is so high. So, something has changed. What has changed? So, the most common theory for why you have so much of myopia is what is called near work hypothesis. What does it mean? It means that, let us say you focus on a book or you focus on a computer screen for a very long time, that ends up increasing the pressure inside the eye, and that increase in pressure is what elongates the eyeball. and as I showed you, when the eyeball gets elongated, that is when the light does not focus on the retina, it focuses in front of the retina and you see blurry images. Now, this was the hypothesis that was thought to be correct for a very long time, and yet if you look at the empirical evidence for the same, it is equivocal. Okay. There are some studies which suggest that this might be the case. There are many studies which actually finds no correlation between lot of near work and myopia. So, what exactly is going on? So, it turns out there is a much more recent hypothesis which says that this normal eye elongation, okay, so the normal level of elongation, normal magnitude, that requires a mix of complex visual stimuli. It is not about the strain that you put by reading on the screen. It is about what are the various kinds of stimulus that your eye is getting. Now, people whose eye lack all this complex visual stimuli, their eyeball does not elongate properly, in fact ends up elongating a bit more, and they are the people who end up developing myopia. Now, one of the things that we know has happened is that in modern times, particularly in cities, the kind of visual stimulus that we get is actually very, very less. And particularly, if you are, let us say, spending most of your time in a high rise building, indoor, looking at a computer or a book, you are not really being exposed to, let us say, greenery, you are not really being exposed to changes in stimulus. Very importantly, you are not being exposed to the bright sunlight. So, bright sunlight turns out to be one of the biggest things over here. So, all these modern environment in which we find ourselves, most of them are actually leading to this kind of a situation, because of which the incidence of myopia is going up. Now, turns out that there are quite some support from studies on other animals. There is quite a bit of support even from human studies, but every single thing has not yet been worked out. So, if you want to look at support from the human studies, that Lingam et al. 2020 review, that is what talks about that support, but still I do not think this is something that is totally accepted. People are still working on it to show that yes, this is undoubtedly the cause. We go to the next example of evolutionary mismatch, and this is related to the fact that over the last few decades, the incidences of autoimmune diseases and allergy related diseases has greatly increased all over the world. It has, again, it is not yet become an epidemic at the level of myopia, but it is almost at the level of an epidemic. And there is a hypothesis over here, is that a significant increase in use of antibiotics, and sorry, this is not a hypothesis, this is actually an observation, that there has also been a significant increase in the use of antibiotics, and our overall exposure to microbes has generally reduced quite a bit. This is also true of those microbes with which we have co-evolved over our evolutionary history. So, there is this hypothesis called the hygiene hypothesis, which suggests that if you are exposed to certain microbes during your childhood, when you are growing up, then this actually ends up educating your immune system. It ends up telling your immune system that, hey, look, these microbes, these are okay, these are good, these are something that we need to be able to tolerate. Also, this creates this memory kind of a thing, and because of all that, later in life the risk of allergy and autoimmune disorders actually goes down drastically. So, this hypothesis was first proposed by this person called David Strachan in 1989, and today this is again a somewhat controversial hypothesis. There are many studies which claim to support it. Unfortunately, there are many studies which say that no, it does not really work. So, this is something on which people are really working, and we need to keep our mind and eyes open to see which way the science is going. The third major example that I am going to talk about is diabetes. Now, diabetes is one of those ancient diseases. It has been mentioned by the ancient Egyptians about 1550 BC. Then even Indian ancient texts, 5th, 6th century BC, they talk about it. The Chinese talk about it. Pretty much all old civilizations which have a history of traditional medicine, they talk about it. Now, it was never a very common disease, and yet particularly in the last 40 years or so, the disease incidence has gone up drastically. So, in 1980 we had an estimated 108 million individuals with diabetes. Today in 2014 the number climbed up to about 422. If you think about it, that is about 3.5 times, more close to 4 times increase in a span of just 34 years, right. That is 1.5 human generation, roughly speaking. In 2025, that is today, 589 million adults, that is 1 in 9 adults, are living with diabetes. The prediction is that by 2050 this number will rise to 853 million. Okay. 1 million, remember, is 10 lakhs. I mean, these are mind boggling numbers, absolutely mind boggling numbers, and therefore the whole question is that if you think about 1980 levels where it was 108 million to 2050 where it is 853 million. So, in a span of about 70 years we expect it to increase about 8 times. That is mind boggling. Okay. Obviously something is happening. What is happening? Now, one of the hypotheses that has been put forward to explain this evolutionary hypothesis is what is known as the thrifty gene hypothesis, proposed by James V. Neal in 1962. What does it say? So, it says that our ancestors, they never really had a constant supply of food. So, they had situations where suppose someday they got a big hunt, so they would be getting a lot of meat, and then there would be periods when they would get nothing and they would simply starve. So, there will be cycles of so called feast or famine. Now, because of this, we evolved genes which favored becoming very good in terms of extracting as much nutrition when food was available and storing it in the body, particularly as fat, such that when there was a famine state, then you could have some stored nutrients which you could use. Now, unfortunately, today the situation is not like that. Today we have a constant supply of food, and most often this food is very, very high calorie. Therefore, these thrifty genes, which are extremely good at extracting the nutrition and storing it, now it has actually turned into a bane. Now it is essentially storing all that nutrient and releasing it when we actually do not need it to do that, and that is what has led to both obesity and type 2 diabetes, which are known to be very strongly related to each other. So, this hypothesis prima facie makes a lot of sense, but what evidences do we have for or against it? Turns out that again it is a mixed bag. So, there are studies in which people have claimed that they have identified the thrifty genes in certain populations. I am giving you one example, but there are other studies which have not been able to find any consistent evidence. Okay. So, it is again a mixed bag, and overall the situation is that we do not have sufficient evidence to either conclusively accept it or reject it. Now, there is something one has gone forward with the same overall understanding about the evolutionary cause of diabetes, and that is something which is known, well, it does not really have a name, but we can call it the doves and diplomats hypothesis. So, this is associated with this famous evolutionary biologist from India called Professor Milind Vatve. He happened to be my colleague at IISER Pune till 2019. So, what Milind proposed is that, again, when we evolved as hunter gatherers, but a hunting gathering lifestyle, it carries a lot of risk, particularly risk of injury to the skin. Now, he proposed, and he actually has enormous amount of data to validate his proposition, that humans have evolved several biochemical pathways which are optimized to a situation wherein you have a high risk of getting these kind of injuries. Now, turns out that one of the things that have happened in our modern lifestyle, even in low income countries or low income sections of the society, is that the risk of physical injury has actually gone down drastically, right. Now, because of that, the suggestion is that all these biochemical pathways which have evolved for that kind of a risky lifestyle, nowadays in the absence of that risk, these biochemical pathways have turned against us, and that is what is leading to all these diabetes and obesity and so on. Now, it is a very interesting hypothesis. That book that I am showing you over there, that book contains enormous amount of information about why they think that this is the way in which it has happened. But the reason I am showing you this particular hypothesis is because this has actually led to something practical and tangible. What is that? So, in this particular context, note that the whole idea is that initially we had risk of injury, or we led a more aggressive lifestyle, which is why the doves part, and now we are living the lifestyle of a diplomat, which is a more sedentary, risk free kind of a thing. So, if that be the case, this automatically suggests that one potential way of controlling for diabetes is to simulate those kinds of injuries, or at least risks of injury. So, taking this into account, Professor Vatve actually tied up with a local Pune hospital. There is some hospital called here, very famous hospital called Dinanath Mangeshkar Hospital. So, they came up with what is known as this BUILD exercise clinic, where BUILD stands for Behavioral Intervention for Life Cycle Disorders. So, what they do is, there is exercise, but these are not your regular gym kind of exercise. These are exercises where, for example, you can see over here, right, they are punching bags, right. Here this is Professor Milind Vatve. So, here you can see him balancing himself on a inflatable rubber ball, which actually is surprisingly difficult, particularly when you are slightly older, right, because it is very easy to fall. So, turns out that these are the kinds of exercises which actually have some potential of injury. There is some potential of those biochemical pathways that have evolved to fire in a slightly different way, and Professor Vatve's claim is that this is what is going to control for diabetes in a way much more effective than the current drugs. Now, is that really the case? I do not know. I have been chatting with Professor Vatve for quite some time. They are still collecting the data. I think they were trying to get a trial done, medical trial done. I do not know where it went, but essentially this is a very interesting potential, at least of treating diabetes in a very different way. So, this was about evolutionary medicine, which is primarily about our health. Turns out that there is a full subdiscipline called evolutionary psychology, which tries to do in terms of mental health what evolutionary medicine tries to do in terms of physical health. So, this is a subject which studies contemporary human behaviors and mental processes as products of evolution operating on our ancestors, and essentially it is a selectionist way of thinking, and people have used that to explain many phenomena. So, for example, humans, we have a moral code, many of us do at least, and the evolutionary psychology explanation for that is that humans have evolved moral code because it allows us to reduce conflict and thereby live in a group. Similarly, many humans, we help each other. So, evolutionary psychology tries to explain that in terms of reciprocal altruism and kin selection, right, concepts that we talked about. And it essentially says that we are altruistic either towards our kin because that increases our inclusive fitness, or we are altruistic under those situations wherein if we help somebody, then we expect that they will help us back tomorrow. Similarly, mental health, depression. So, evolutionary psychologists would say that depression can be good for us under certain situations. One of the situations that has been proposed is that when we evolved, then anything that led us away from the group was a problem, and therefore, just like we have evolved pain to tell us that something has gone wrong in the body, we have evolved melancholy or some kind of a mental pain which allows us to notice situations where we have gone away from the group. So, in this way of thinking, the depression that we face nowadays is because of our highly neutral, sorry not neutral, nuclear families that have become the norm, because of which we are losing connection with our fellow human beings, and because of that our evolved mental pain circuit has now started firing all the time, because of which we feel depressed. So, these are all somewhat controversial theories, and there are many reasons for these controversies. And although evolutionary psychology is a fairly established field, there are multiple textbooks on that topic. In spite of that, there are many people who tend to be strong critics of this theory. Major criticisms include, here the whole assumption is that everything is in the genes, but when it comes to behavior, we know that the context, the social context, the environmental context plays a much bigger role in shaping our behavior than compared to, let us say, shaping some kind of a physiological mechanism. So, evolutionary psychology is, many people have argued, talking that all things are just determined by genes and the context does not matter, which many people argue is not at all correct, and I would somewhat agree along that axis. Another major thing is that evolutionary psychology assumes that everything is an adaptation. Everything does not need to be an adaptation. Many things might be just collateral responses, and therefore, many people are uneasy with this way of trying to explain everything as effect of selection, and they many a times argue that the hypothesis that evolutionary psychology people are coming up with, they are essentially unfalsifiable, because all of them are assuming that something was very good for our hunter gatherer ancestors. There is no way we can prove that. We cannot go back in time to our hunter gatherer ancestors and see whether that particular behavior was indeed something that was providing a fitness advantage at that point of time. So, it is essentially a lot of just so stories. So, overall, again, evolutionary psychology is something that evokes emotional response, but as I said, there is a critical mass of people who are trying to make this area more scientifically rigorous, and I am sure at some point we are going to get more information and more data when more experiments are done. So, whatever we did till this point, was application of evolution in the context of biology. Now, of course, that is where I focused, because this course was Introduction to Evolutionary Biology. But I would like to end this with telling you about how the principles of evolution can and are actually applied way beyond biology. So, we have this concept called universal Darwinism, which suggests that any system which exhibits variation, selection and heredity will undergo a process of evolution. If you think about it closely, that makes sense. And in this particular context, variation is in terms of random changes, or which are analogous to biological mutations, that occur within a population of what here is called as replicators. So, this could be, say, a new idea, it could be a new meme, it could be a new design for a robot or for any machine or anything. So, this is how variation comes into the picture. Then there has to be some kind of a fitness differential, which means that certain variation should have a greater likelihood of survivorship, or a greater likelihood of being chosen, or a greater likelihood of being copied, and so on. So, for example, in the context of business, a strategy that leads to higher profit, or in the context of memes, a meme that has a greater appeal compared to another meme, and so on. And finally, there has to be something analogous to heredity, which in this case is typically called retention, which is that the successful variants, the ones which have a higher quote unquote fitness, they are preserved and they are passed on to the next iteration or next generation of replicators. So, for example, suppose you have a meme and people are forwarding that meme on WhatsApp to different people. So, each time a forward is happening, the meme, one extra copy is being generated and it is reaching out to somebody else. So, that is the way you have the information going forward. So, this concept is applied across many disciplines. Frankly speaking, the examples are too large. It has been applied in linguistics, art, music, epistemology, economics, ethics, cultural selection. The list is very long. And in each one of these cases, there is a proper subdiscipline within those disciplines which are trying to apply these principles. We do not really have time to get into all that. What we will do is we will look at just two. One is in the context of computer science, so called evolutionary computation, and the other is in the context of chemistry, the so called directed evolution. So, let us first look at evolutionary computation. What is it? So, it is essentially a set of computational methods that solve complex problems using evolutionary principles. Now, there are many paradigms. One of the paradigms is known as genetic algorithm. This is the one which has been used most often, and this works as follows, pretty much the same 3 steps that I told you in evolutionary Darwinism, universal Darwinism. So, it creates a random population of solutions. So, here population is not a biological population. Here population simply means a collection, collection of some kinds of entities. So, it creates a random population of solutions and then it evaluates their performance. This is analogous to fitness, and then it breeds or propagates the best solutions to create a new improved generation. So, this is how you get selection and heredity, and then these 3 steps, these keep on happening in a loop till the desired goal is reached. So, let me give you one example of this which should make the concept a little clearer. So, suppose you have a target, in this particular case it is a photo of Darwin, and you need to reach that target, starting from some start point. How will you reach there? So, in the context of evolutionary computation or genetic algorithm, the first step that will be done will be to get hold of a large number of populations, get hold of a large number of individuals, each one of them having different, basically just pixel values, each one of them composed of some random pixels. So, here each pixel has a value. You know, a pixel is the dots that picture cell, the dots that are used to compose this image. So, each pixel has a grayscale value which goes from 0 to 255. Okay. So, one side is black, the other side is white, and everything in between is contained within those values. Now, what you have is a population of many such pictures where each pixel has been initiated from random grayscale values from this range 0 to 255. Okay. So, you have all these values. Now, what you do is you evaluate the fitness of each picture. How do you evaluate the fitness of each picture? So, what you do is, so suppose you take this pixel over here, okay, this is your pixel in the target, and then you take this corresponding pixel over here in this one. Okay. Now, what you do is you, let us say this, the value of this pixel, this one, let us say is say 10. Let us say the value, you have started from a random thing, over here is say 15. So, you do 10 minus 15 and then you square this up. Okay. So, this gives you 5 square 25, right. Then you take the second pixel over here and you subtract that value from the second pixel over here, say 23 minus say 13. Okay. And you square that up. So, that is 10 square is 100, correct. So, you keep on doing this for every single pixel in this particular picture, right. So, when you do that, you are going to get some sum over here, right, and that sum is essentially the sum of the squared difference from the target in the grayscale value for each pixel. So, that sum that you are getting over here is some measure of the fitness. Now, in this particular case it actually goes in the other direction, because the closer is the pixel value to this, the lower will be this sum and higher will be the fitness. So, lower sum equal to higher fitness, correct. So, the basic point is that by doing this, for this picture you will get a fitness value. So, call it fitness value 1. Similarly, you will get 1 for here, fitness 2 of 2, 3 and so on and so forth, correct. So, you have each picture and you have figured out how different it is from the target, and in the process of that you have figured out the fitness values. Now, lower the sum, fitter is the picture. Now, what are the steps in the evolution? So, you have evaluated the fitness as I told you. Then what you do is you rank all the individual pictures in descending order of their fitness. So, let us assume that my say 20th picture is the fittest one, has the lowest sum. So, this rank is equal to 1. So, let us assume the next one, say 35, picture number 35 has rank 2 and so on and so forth. So, you rank each one of them in descending order of their fitness. Now, in this particular example, what we are doing is we are mixing some pixel color from the next higher individual. So, let us say this is my highest rank. Okay. So, randomly I will take some pixel in this picture and replace them with the pixel values of the next one, right. So, that is what is meant by going from 2 to 1. Similarly, let us say I have rank 3, I will take some pixel values from this randomly and I will replace the pixel values over here with pixel values from here, correct, and I do this for every single picture. Now, what happens? I have had mutation, I have had changes, okay, and now these 3 steps I will keep them doing them in a loop. Now, because after I have done this mutation, now whichever was the fittest picture earlier may not necessarily remain the fittest picture, right. So, now again I will do the re-ranking, and then I will keep on doing this, and each iteration I will simply take the picture which has the highest fitness, which means the picture which summed over all pixel values is closest to my target. Okay. That is the process. Can you see how this is analogous to evolution? Okay. This particular step is creating mutation, okay, and this ranking is essentially what is analogous to selection. Now, what happens if you do all that? Let us see. So, here is my target picture, and here each frame that you are seeing is the fittest picture, okay, and it is now then being replaced by the fittest picture in the next iteration, and so on, and see where it goes. Can you see this? Starting from a totally random population of values, see how this is converging towards the target. Now, what is the main difference between normal evolution, biological evolution, and this one? In this particular case, a target has been given, and because a target has been given, therefore, you are evaluating fitness in terms of the difference from that target. So, this is directed evolution in some sense, as opposed to the random nature of biological evolution. That is where the main difference arises. Okay. So, now obviously the big question is, fine, this looks like a nice game, but can this be of any use? And turns out that this is actually of very major use, and I will just show you one example, and this is in the context of antenna. Now, what is an antenna? So, an antenna is an electronic device that converts an alternating electric current into radio waves or vice versa. So, people who are my age will remember that when we used to have televisions at home, there used to be this antenna, or the aerial as we used to call it, on the roof, and every now and then we had to go up on the roof and turn that antenna to improve the reception of the signal, right. Now, turns out that although we have now moved to satellite television and set top box and so on and so forth, turns out that one area which still depends on antenna are actually the space missions, because when you are going to the space, then you need to have continuous communication with Earth, and for that you need to have antennas of various shapes depending on what kind of radio frequency is being used and what is the way in which that radio frequency is going to reach you. So, the people who have probably done more research on this than anybody else are NASA, and since early 2000s NASA actually has been using genetic algorithm of the kind that I showed you to design these antennae, particularly for unusual use cases. And one of their most famous designs, the first one which went to the space, was in a 2006 NASA mission called Space Technology 5 or ST5, and this is the antenna that they set. So, this antenna was totally developed using genetic algorithm, and you can see the very peculiar shape of the antenna over here, right. Now, they also tried doing it manually, but turned out that this was the design that gave far better result compared to what was coming out manually. So, this is just one example, definitely not the only example, and many more such antennae have been designed and used subsequently by NASA. So, this brings us to our second example, a very important example nowadays, which is known as directed evolution, primarily in the area of chemistry or protein engineering. So, what is it? So, it is a protein engineering method which steers proteins or nucleic acids towards a user defined goal using a selection based process. What do I mean by all that? So, I will just give you one example. So, suppose there is a protein and you want to improve the properties of that protein. What will you do? So, here what is done is that you extract the gene for that protein, you create some mutations randomly. So, you have a library of genes, and then you put all those genes into some vector like E. coli. So, here you have E. coli expressing the gene library, then you let the E. coli grow, and then you essentially do an assay to see how your protein is working. And once you have done that assay, you have a rank saying, okay, this E. coli strain is doing the best, this is second, this is third, fourth, etc. So, what you do is the lowest performing ones, you just reject them, take the one which is doing the best, or a few, let us say a top 4 5 of those. Then from these isolate the genes, and then using things like either error prone PCR, or using transposons, or using chemical mutagenesis, in which case some of these cases you have to do it right here. You then create the library for the next iteration, this one, and then you keep on doing this, okay, again and again and again, until you reach your desired level of enhancement of functioning. Now, the best thing about this is when you compare it with how normal protein designing is done. So, for normal improvement of protein engineering, what you do is you take the structure of the protein, and using your knowledge of bioinformatics, you try to predict that, okay, if I change this residue from say a valine to a leucine, or a isoleucine to a proline, something like that, then the structure of the protein will change like this, and if the structure of the protein changes like this, then this is the way in which the function will change, it will improve or not. Okay. So, here in the traditional method, using site directed mutagenesis, you need to have an excellent understanding of what the structure of the protein is and how changing one residue to another is going to lead to an improvement. Now, that even with all the computational methods that we have is not at all easy. What this method does is, it says that you need no such knowledge, you just keep on doing it randomly and hope that evolution at some point is going to take care of it, and turns out that it is actually an extremely effective method. Evolution is indeed very, very useful in designing proteins with good function, so much so that in 2018 the Nobel Committee recognized this and gave the Nobel Prize in Chemistry to Francis Arnold, George Smith and Gregory Winter for their work in directed evolution. What is more important to note over here is that not only is this a method which is very interesting, this has actually led to several commercial products which are right now in the market. This method of directed evolution, many people hope, will be one of our major ways by which we will be able to create new drugs. So, if antibiotics and other things. So, if you remember in our last discussion, we saw that we have not been able to discover a new antibiotic, I will take that back. We have been discovering new antibiotics, but at an extremely low rate, and most of those antibiotics are actually not making it to the market. So, the whole idea is that directed evolution will be one way by which we will be able to make such drugs at scale and much faster. So, this was about application of evolution. This is where the course ends, but in reality, although the course ends, the journey of evolutionary biology obviously continues. So, this is the website which is associated with this course. I strongly recommend that you visit this website. You are going to get quite a few extra things over here. So, for example, for every video you are going to find a summary. All the links that I am mentioning in the videos, we are going to put up those links over there. We are going to also put up many extra resources for you to explore on your own. We have still not done that, but hopefully we will do that over the coming months. And more importantly, I mean, this was a basic course, right? For everything that I was able to discuss with you, there were so many other things that we could not discuss. So I intend, hopefully if I get time, to create many other interesting videos about different aspects of evolution, and if all goes well, over the next few months or next several months actually, I want to create those videos and put them up on the website. So, you will find a lot of food for thought over there as well. So, that is about it. Thank you very much for being a part of the course. See you whenever we see you next. Bye.